started as a dare like these things often do. I wasn't exactly eager to spend the night alone in Pine Haven Forest, but when Jake, the self-proclaimed king of stupid ideas, bet me $500 I couldn't last until dawn, my pride overruled my better judgment. Pine Haven wasn't the kind of place you'd want to visit at night. Locals swapped stories about strange sightings, disappearing hikers, and that peculiar buzzing noise only heard deep in the woods. But I'd grown up rolling my eyes at campfire tales, dismissing them as overactive imaginations fueled by too many horror movies. I set out just before sunset with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a backpack full of snacks and water. The plan was simple: hike to the old ranger station about 2 miles in, stay the night, and head back in the morning. Easy money, right? The first half-mile was peaceful, almost serene. The fading sunlight filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the trail. But as the light dwindled, the forest took on a different character. The trees seemed closer, their silhouettes like crooked fingers reaching skyward. The air grew still, almost heavy, and the usual forest sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, faded into an oppressive silence. That's when I heard the first sound, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words. I froze, straining to hear, but it stopped. Probably the wind, I thought, though there wasn't even the hint of a breeze. I shook it off and kept moving, my footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel path. The ranger station was exactly as I'd remembered it from my childhood. A small, dilapidated cabin with a busted window and a porch that looked ready to collapse. I stepped inside and felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like I was trespassing on sacred ground. The air was stale, tinged with the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the window and checked my phone. No signal. That was expected, but still it unnerved me. The flashlight cast long shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper as I tried to convince myself to relax. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. A slow, deliberate scrape against the outside wall of the cabin. My heart raced as I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Probably just a raccoon, I whispered to myself. But when the scratching moved, first to the window, then to the door, I knew it wasn't an animal. Something was circling the cabin. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it rang in my ears. That's when the doorknob started to turn. It wasn't a frantic motion, like someone trying to force their way in. It was slow, methodical, as if the intruder knew I was inside and wanted to savor the fear they were causing. I clutched my flashlight like a weapon, my knuckles turning white. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice trembling. No response, just the slow, deliberate turning of the knob. Then, a voice, soft, almost playful, whispered through the crack in the door. "Let me in." Sounded human, but not quite. There was an unnatural edge to it, like a recording played backward. I was frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, the doorknob stopped turning. The voice fell silent. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours, and just when I thought it was over, the window shattered. A shadowy figure crawled through, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an impossible angle, and its eyes, pitch black and glistening, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear as the figure crouched by the shattered window, its head tilting back and forth in sharp, unnatural motions like a bird sizing up prey. It let out a low, guttural sound, half a growl, half a laugh, that sent ice shooting through my veins. Its fingers, long, gnarled, and ending in claws that looked like they could carve through bone, gripped the windowsill as it pulled itself into the cabin. Every movement was deliberate, like it had all the time in the world to toy with me. I snapped out of my paralysis and scrambled backward, flashlight trembling in my hand. I fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon, my fingers brushing against an old, rusted crowbar near the corner. I gripped it tightly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear me. The thing stood upright now, taller than I'd expected, its head nearly brushing the low ceiling. Its chest expanded and contracted as if it were breathing, though no air seemed to enter or leave its body. Those pitch-black eyes locked onto me, and it took a step forward, its feet making no sound against the creaky wooden floor. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking. I raised the crowbar, though I had no idea what good it would do. The thing tilted its head again, as if amused. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice a distorted echo, like a dozen people whispering in unison. I felt my knees buckle. My instincts screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Behind me was a wall. In front of me, this nightmare made flesh. It took another step forward, and the air in the cabin seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around it. Desperation took over. I swung the crowbar with all my strength, aiming for its head. The blow connected with a sickening crack, but the thing barely flinched. Instead, it turned its head slowly back to me, the faintest trace of a smile curling at the corners of its too wide mouth. Its hand shot out, faster than I could react, and grabbed the crowbar, wrenching it from my grip with inhuman strength. It tossed the weapon aside as if it were nothing. "This is my home," it growled, "and you are trespassing." The floor beneath us began to tremble, the cabin groaning like it was alive. The shadows in the room stretched and twisted, swallowing the faint beam of my flashlight. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The thing moved closer, its long limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "What do you want?" Paused, its head tilting again. For a moment, I thought it might answer. Instead, it reached out one clawed hand and pressed a finger to my chest. The cold was unbearable, like ice piercing straight through my skin. My vision blurred as a flood of images assaulted my mind. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, and things that couldn't possibly exist. Screaming faces, twisting landscapes, a void that stretched endlessly. The images vanished as quickly as they had come, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The thing crouched over me now, its black eyes gleaming with malice. "You'll leave," it said, its voice softer now, almost mocking. "But you'll never forget." It rose to its full height and turned, moving back toward the shattered window with the same jerky, unsettling motions. For a moment, I thought it was going to leave, but just as it reached the window, it stopped and turned back to me. "And if you ever come back," it said, "you'll stay. Forever." With that, it disappeared into the night, its form blending seamlessly with the shadows outside. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too shaken to even cry. Eventually, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the broken window. Only then did I find the strength to stand, grab my bag, and stumble out of the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way back to the trailhead. When I finally emerged, Jake was waiting in his truck, grinning like a fool. "Man, you look like hell," he said. "Guess I owe you $500. I didn't answer him. Couldn't. All I could think about was the thing's final words, and the dark, hollow look in its eyes. I've never told anyone about what happened that night, not even Jake. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those images. The screaming faces, the endless void, and hear the thing's voice whispering in the back of my mind. "You'll never forget." And I haven't. For weeks after that night in Pine Haven Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even in the safety of my apartment, the shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. I kept my curtains drawn and checked the locks obsessively. Every creak in the floorboards or groan of the pipes made my heart race. But the thing never showed up, at least not in a way I could see. I convinced myself it was over, a horrible, unexplainable event that I'd somehow survived. Life crept back to normal, or as normal as it could after staring into the abyss. Jake teased me about how rattled I'd been when he picked me up that morning, but I let it slide. He didn't need to know. No one did. That is, until the buzzing started. It was faint at first, so subtle I thought it was in my head. a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It grew louder at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, and would stop the moment I turned on a light. I tried to convince myself it was tinnitus, stress, or maybe just my overactive imagination. But one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized it wasn't random. It was coming from the forest. I hadn't set foot near Pine Haven since that night, but now I couldn't shake the urge to go back. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even courage. It was compulsion. That buzzing, incessant and maddening, seemed to pull at me, demanding I return to the cabin. I held out for as long as I could, but eventually the pull became too much. Armed with a flashlight, a knife, and a shaky resolve, I drove back to the trailhead just before dusk. The parking lot was empty as I'd expected. Most people avoided Pine Haven like the plague, especially at night. The forest seemed darker this time, the trees closer, their gnarled branches forming unnatural shapes against the twilight sky. The air smelled different too, not of pine and earth, but something metallic, like blood. My flashlight flickered as I made my way toward the cabin, the buzzing growing louder with every step. It wasn't coming from the trees or the underbrush, it was coming from underneath. When I reached the cabin, it was worse than I remembered. The broken window gaped like an open wound, and the walls seemed to sag inward, as if the structure was collapsing under its own weight. I hesitated on the threshold, the buzzing now a roar in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Something was waiting inside, something I had to face. The moment I stepped through the door, the buzzing stopped. The silence was suffocating. The air inside the cabin was colder than outside, and the shadows seemed to writhe, alive with unseen movement. I gripped the knife tightly, my knuckles white, as I scanned the room. That's when I saw it. The floorboards in the center of the room were warped and cracked, forming a jagged hole that hadn't been there before. From the darkness below came a faint, sickly green glow. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and the light seemed to draw the shadows toward it, swallowing them whole. I didn't want to go near it, but my body moved on its own, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. As I peered into the hole, the green glow illuminated a twisting tunnel, its walls slick with something that shimmered unnaturally. And then, far below, I saw movement. Something was climbing up. The same long limbs, the same too-wide smile, but now there were more of them. At least a dozen, their black eyes glinting as they crawled, jerking and twisting, toward the surface. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't coming for me. They were spreading out. I staggered back, my mind racing. The buzzing returned, louder than ever, and I understood then that it wasn't random. It was a signal, a summons, calling them out of whatever abyss they'd been hiding in. They weren't bound to the cabin. They were spreading, and I had to stop them. Gripping the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the lantern from the corner, poured the oil across the warped floor, and struck a match. The flames caught instantly, roaring to life as the wood splintered and cracked. The creature screamed, a sound so piercing and unnatural it felt like it would split my skull. I stumbled out of the cabin as the fire consumed it, the green glow flickering and fading in the inferno. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. By the time I turned back, the forest was alive with firelight, the cabin engulfed in flames. The buzzing was gone, replaced by the crackle of burning wood and the distant howl of something unnatural. I never went back to Pine Haven. The fire was blamed on vandals, and the forest was closed to the public indefinitely. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that faint buzzing, growing louder, calling them back. I know they're still out there, and I know they're waiting. I moved 3 states away after the fire. It didn't feel like running, it was running. I needed distance, a fresh start, a place where the shadows didn't seem to follow me home. For a while, it worked. I settled into a new routine, found a job, made a few friends. I even started sleeping through the night again. But then the dreams started. They were vivid and disorienting, always the same. I'd be standing in a dark forest, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The buzzing would start faintly, growing louder until it was deafening, and then I'd see them, those long-limbed figures, their black eyes glinting as they emerged from the shadows. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound still ringing in my ears. I told myself they were just nightmares, echoes of the trauma I'd buried. But deep down, I knew better. The fire hadn't stopped them. It had only slowed them down. The first sign came a few months later on an ordinary evening. I was sitting in my apartment, scrolling through the news on my phone, when a headline caught my eye. Unexplained disappearances near Forest Preserve in Greenville County. I clicked on the article, my stomach knotting with dread. It described a series of hikers who had vanished without a trace, their abandoned gear discovered near a secluded forest. Witnesses reported hearing a strange buzzing noise in the area, but authorities dismissed it as nothing more than wildlife. My hands shook as I read the article. Greenville County was over 200 miles away from Pine Haven, but the details were too familiar to ignore. The buzzing, the disappearances, it was happening again. I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself there was nothing I could do. But a week later, it happened closer to home. A local news report detailed a missing couple who'd gone for a late-night walk near a nearby nature reserve. Witnesses described a strange green light in the woods. That night, the buzzing returned. It started faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it grew louder as the hours passed. By midnight, it was deafening, vibrating through the walls and rattling the windows. I sat in the dark, clutching the knife I kept by my bed, knowing it was useless. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from underneath. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, every sound a prelude to something terrible. And then, a few nights later, I saw it. I was walking home from the corner store, the streetlights flickering overhead, when I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the park. It was tall and thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Even from a distance, I could feel its black eyes boring into me. It didn't move, but I could feel the malice radiating from it, like a predator sizing up its prey. I turned and ran, the buzzing growing louder with every step. By the time I reached my apartment, it had stopped. The figure was gone. The next morning, I found a note on my door. It wasn't written in ink, but in something dark and crusted, like dried blood. 3 words, scrawled in jagged letters. You brought them. I knew then that running wouldn't save me. They'd followed me, and now they were spreading. The final attempt. I've spent the last week researching everything I can about Pine Haven, the buzzing, the green glow. Anything that might explain what these things are and how to stop them. I've found fragments of folklore, scattered reports of similar sightings across the country, but nothing concrete. No one knows what they are or where they come from. But I've learned one thing: fire isn't enough. If they can spread through the shadows, through the ground itself, then the problem is bigger than I ever imagined. Tonight, I'm going back to the park where I saw the figure. I have a plan, a desperate, reckless plan. I've pieced together scraps of rituals from old texts, symbols that supposedly ward off evil, and I'm bringing everything I've got. Salt, candles, a crude talisman I made from iron nails. It might be useless. It might be suicide, but I can't sit here and wait for them to take me, or someone else. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. But you have to listen. If you hear the buzzing, if you see the green light, don't ignore it. They're coming and they're not stopping. Burn the forest if you have to. Salt the earth. Do whatever it takes. Because once they find you, there's no escaping. I arrived at the park just before midnight. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like a chore. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the world knew something was about to happen and had chosen to hold its breath. I'd parked my car a block away and walked the rest of the distance, carrying a duffel bag stuffed with everything I might need. Candles, salt, matches, iron nails, and a battered notebook filled with hastily scrawled notes. My hands trembled as I spread the salt in a wide circle on the grass near the park center, carefully placing the candles at equal intervals. The buzzing began just as I lit the first candle. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the hum of a distant street lamp. But it grew steadily, vibrating in my chest, rattling my teeth. The ground beneath me felt alive, trembling with a low, rhythmic pulse. I worked faster, lighting the remaining candles and carving symbols into the dirt with the iron nails. When the circle was complete, I stood in the center and waited. The park seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The streetlights at the edge of the clearing flickered, then died, plunging the world into darkness. I gripped the talisman in my hand, its rough edges digging into my palm. And then they came. The first one emerged from the shadows between two trees, its long limbs moving jerkily, its head tilting unnaturally as it studied me. Another appeared a moment later, and then another, until the clearing was surrounded by them. A dozen at least, their black eyes glinting in the candlelight, their mouths curling into unnatural smiles. The buzzing was deafening now, a cacophony that drowned out every rational thought. I forced myself to focus, reciting the words I'd memorized from the notebook. The symbols etched into the ground began to glow faintly, the candles flickering wildly as the air grew colder. The creatures didn't move at first, watching with an unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. But as the glow from the symbols intensified, they began to shift, their movements more frantic, their heads snapping back and forth as if searching for an escape. I thought it was working. I thought I'd found a way to stop them. But then the largest one stepped forward, crossing the boundary of the salt circle with ease. The symbols sputtered and dimmed, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. It towered over me, its elongated limbs ending in claws that twitched with anticipation. "You think you understand us?" It hissed, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "But you don't." The circle was useless. The ritual was useless. I'd underestimated them, and now I was trapped. I scrambled backward, clutching the iron talisman like a lifeline. The creature followed, its movements slow and deliberate, savoring my fear. I tried to think, to come up with a plan, but the buzzing in my head was unbearable, drowning out everything except the overwhelming certainty that I was going to die. But then something unexpected happened. The ground beneath us began to tremble, a deep, rumbling vibration that sent cracks spidering through the earth. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the ground as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The largest one turned back to me, its black eyes narrowing. "You woke something," it said, its voice filled with something that might have been fear. "Fool." Before I could respond, the ground split open beneath the creature, swallowing it whole. The others scattered, their jerky movements taking them back into the shadows as the rumbling grew louder. I stumbled out of the circle, barely managing to stay upright as the earth buckled and shifted around me. A deafening roar filled the air, unlike anything I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the world. The green glow returned, spilling out from the cracks in the earth, brighter and more intense than ever. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The buzzing was gone. The glow faded. The park was silent once more. I stood there for what felt like hours, my ears ringing, my mind racing to process what had just happened. The creatures were gone, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I'd woken beneath the earth, whatever they were afraid of, it was still there, waiting. I left the park that night, but I haven't stopped looking over my shoulder since. The buzzing hasn't come back, not yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can't fight the dark. You can only hope it doesn't notice you. It's been 3 years since that night in the park. I've tried to move on, but the truth is you don't move on from something like this. You carry it with you, like a shadow stitched to your soul, always there, always watching. The buzzing hasn't returned, not directly, but I've kept track of the news, and the pattern is undeniable. Forest fires in remote areas, disappearances near isolated parks, stories of strange lights in the woods or eerie noises that seem to come from nowhere. Each one is a whisper, a clue that they're still out there, spreading, adapting, waiting. I've spent every waking moment trying to understand what happened, piecing together fragments of folklore, old myths, even cryptic messages left in forgotten forums and obscure blogs. The creatures I saw, the things that chased me through the dark, they're not unique. Variations of their description pop up in cultures across the world. Shadow people, forest walkers, hollow ones. Call them what you want, but they're older than we are. Older than the trees. And the worst part? I think they're only the beginning. Whatever I woke that night in the park, whatever pulled them back into the earth, wasn't there to save me. It wasn't a guardian or a protector. It was something worse, something so vast and incomprehensible that even those creatures feared it. I've dreamed of it every night since. A shifting mass of shadows and light, endless and hungry, stretching beyond the limits of my understanding. I've come to believe the buzzing isn't just a sound. It's a signal, a frequency meant to tune our minds to something we can't comprehend. The longer you hear it, the harder it is to resist. The creatures are part of it, emissaries or scouts, softening the ground for whatever comes next. And I think I've been marked. I've moved 6 times in 3 years, but the signs always follow. A strange figure lingering in the corner of my vision. Flickering lights, shadows that seem to shift when I'm not looking. I know it's only a matter of time before they find me again, before the buzzing starts, and this time I don't think I'll get away. So I'm writing this down. Not as a warning, because I don't think there's anything you can do to stop it, but as a record, a testament, proof that when it happens, when the shadows rise and the buzzing fills the air, you weren't imagining it. If you hear the buzzing, don't ignore it. Don't go looking for answers. Don't think you can fight it. Because once you've been marked, it doesn't matter how far you run or how well you hide. The dark always finds you. And if you're reading this, then maybe it's already too late.